Welcome back, everyone. This will be the first in two parts of a lecture about Chapter 1, Mass Communication, a Critical Approach. As we begin to look at mass communication as the subject of our study for the rest of the semester, I think it's important to understand why we should study mass communication. Mass communication helps us understand the culture and the society around us. A lot of times we think about mass communication just as television or radio, like very singular points of communication. And yet mass communication becomes a cultural context that allows us to understand us as individuals, as groups and society, and help us make sense of our lives. Communication really is about shared experiences, it's about history, practices that bind us together and create this larger culture that we draw on for our values every single day. And yet, a lot of the times we don't sit and examine how our culture came to be. And so studying mass communication can be an important part of that process because culture is primarily delivered through mass communication products. In thinking about what mass communication is, it's really the combination of communication and mass media. Communication is a large umbrella term that discusses the means of sending or receiving information. Communication can be any form. So here in my example, you see Forrest Gump talking to the woman on the park bench. This is called in-person communication, face-to-face communication. It's what you do when you're in the room with someone. Now, they're thankfully trying to social distance, although they could be wearing masks, I suppose. But this communication is in person and it's one-on-one. Mass communication, though, focuses on large groups of people. This is usually done through mass media. Mass media are the channels that are used to distribute cultural messages to large groups of people. So in this example, when Forrest Gump is attending the rally in DC, and he gets up at the podium and speaks into all these microphones and all of these radio stations, he is producing mass communication because it's going out to a large group of people through various channels. And so that can help you to understand the difference between communication, which is any type of sending or receiving, and the specific kind of communication we'll be looking at this semester, mass communication. Now, in thinking about what communication is, it's important to understand the linear model of communication. This may look really complicated, but I promise it's not. In essence, every time you communicate with someone, whether that's talking to them face-to-face or whether that's you listening to me lecture through this video, all of those communications follow a similar model. The first part of that model is the source. That's the person that is trying to share information with someone else. And what they do is they take that information and they encode the information to become a message. I have a lot of things as your instructor that I want to share with you about mass communication. But first I have to think about how I want to present that information to you. What message do I want to deliver to you? And so I encode all of the things that I want to tell you in a way that you hopefully will be able to understand and appreciate. I do that through the message. Here, the message are the words that I'm telling you. It's the visuals that I'm sending to you through the video. It's the audio that you're getting to hear from my voice. Now, the channel of communication is kind of like the platform. It's the mode of sending that communication. In this instance, you're watching my YouTube videos, and that is the channel of communication that you're receiving. But if this were an in-person class, the channel might be through my in-person lecturing. So there are all different forms of channels of communication, everything from television, YouTube videos, social media. You have written communication through books or newspapers or magazines. You even have audio channels specifically, such as podcast or radio. All of these things have different modalities or characteristics that will change the message. Finally, you as the receiver kind of decode the information that I'm telling you. You take in the information that I'm telling you and you interpret it given your current knowledge, your current communication skills, attitudes, and even your own culture. And so this allows you to understand the communication process. It starts with someone, the source, who wants to tell you something. They decide what that something they want to tell you is and shape it into a message. They then deliver that message through a channel, and you receive that information to take it in and decide how you want to use it. The linear model of communication originally was only the SMCR, and that's what you'll call it a lot of times. You'll hear it called SMCR model of communication. But a little later on, other researchers and scholars noticed that there was no form of feedback allowed. So, for instance, if I'm sending you a YouTube video, you have the ability to comment back to me the source of information about what I'm sharing with you. Well, there was no feedback loop that took into account that the receivers were able to provide feedback to the source. If we were sitting in an in-person classroom or even a synchronous classroom on Zoom, your nonverbal expression, your eye rolling or seeming bored would give me feedback as the source of information that you were not into my class, which of course would not happen, I'm sure. But the feedback allows the receiver to communicate things back to the source, which may change the overall process of communication later on. In looking at an example from something that I love, Harry Potter, you can think about it in this way. If we're talking about the book series Harry Potter, the source of the information would be the author, J.K. Rowling. She takes information or stories that she wants to share with people, and she encodes them using her language, using her linguistic written means to create books. And those books have many messages in them, everything from inclusivity to everyone, discrimination, the battle against good and evil. All of those messages are contained within her novels. The channels are through the means of books, actual physical literary books, or perhaps you listen on the audiobooks. I absolutely love Jim Dale. I listen to it very often, the audiobooks. But then the receiver are those people who are buying the books in those midnight releases. I'm pretty sure I can see myself in the background. I used to do that all the time when these books came out. So I was definitely a receiver of J.K. Rowling's novels. But you could also think about the Harry Potter series in terms of the movies. And the source of the movies, you know, while influenced by J.K. Rowling, and she was an executive producer on the project, of course, but the director and producer of the movies are also a very important source because they determine how the movies are going to be messaged differently than the books. The channel is also different. You're talking about a movie theater as opposed to an actual physical book. And the receivers might be different too. My husband, for example, has seen a few of the movies against his will, but he's never actually read the books. So he is a different receiver of the movies than receivers of the books would be. And of course, various feedback is available for the different types of communication in Harry Potter. Everything from fan fiction to ticket sales can provide feedback back to the source about what they like or don't like about the communication about Harry Potter. So the original linear model of communication was conceptualized as kind of a hypodermic needle theory. If you think about how a needle works, it just directly injects whatever is inside that needle into the individual, and the individual really has no control over what that whatever is in the needle does to them. This theory was developed in the 20s and 30s when a lot of media effects was just beginning. And it was based on the linear communication theory having a passive audience. That's why there was no feedback loop in the original SMCR model. because there was really no individual difference about how the media affects you. It's also why it's called the magic bullet theory. It's like the media is shooting out information into the crowd and it just hits everyone in the crowd the exact same. It's just this magic bullet that you can't stop the media from affecting you. But the problem is that senders cannot control how messages are decoded or interpreted by receivers, and not everyone is affected by the media in the same way. For instance, you might really like being able to listen to my lectures through a slideshow or through YouTube videos, but other people may hate this form. And I'm sorry if that's you. I will try to make it as interesting as possible. But as you can see, even people within this class are going to interpret my lectures being done through this modality differently. So as we moved on from the hypodermic needle theory, which has kind of been debunked as not being really true because there is individual choice and there is individual difference with media, we moved into the two-step flow of communication where the media work by influencing the culture. So instead of just influencing all individual people the same way, the media really shape and define cultural values that then influence individuals. And so you may buy into a certain culture more than another, and that is how media is really effective. Now, it's also important to consider that not all information gets shared through mass communication. Along the SMCR model, there are many gatekeepers or people who are deciding what can and cannot be said. For instance, a journalist may have a great investigative story about a company who's doing something wrong in the community. But if the editor sees that that company is also a large advertiser with the newspaper or a broadcast company, then the editor may prevent that journalist from sharing that information because they don't want it to affect their bottom line. Therefore, that communication may or may not ever be shared with the public, depending upon whether that journalist then goes through other channels to be able to do that. It's also why there are very few minority voices being seen in Hollywood. Producers are gatekeepers that tend to want to produce the same thing over and over again because it makes economic profit. And so different kind of perspectives or voices tend to be riskier for those companies and don't get made as often. Even social media algorithms are meant to show you things that they know will keep you on the site for a long time, and therefore keep out different voices and information that you may not see. So this really brings us to a cultural approach for mass communication, where individuals are bringing meaning and experiences to the message. There are all types of things about you as an individual that will make you either agree with, interpret, refashion, or reject a certain message. You know, if I'm making misogynistic jokes, things that demean women, and I am a woman, I'm probably going to be less likely to accept and agree with that message based on my gender. We can also see how age might make you interpret a message differently. And there are all kinds of individual factors that really affect the way that media affects you. One of the ways is through a selective exposure. And this really reinforces the idea that media tends to produce the same kind of culture over and over again, both for individuals and then culture at large, because we tend to seek out media that align with our current views and beliefs. We tend to also interpret messages as individuals to support our own viewpoints. And so if I'm taking in news, I want news that looks like what I already believe. And if I'm receiving news that is different than what I believe, I have to interpret it in a way that does not break down my entire viewpoint of the world. That does happen sometimes, but it's very disruptive to our individual lives, and therefore we try to keep that to a minimum, of course. So this is why a Republican might want to watch Fox News, which tends to be more conservative, because those conservative news messages would align with their current viewpoints. Meanwhile, a Democrat would be more likely to watch a more liberal news station like MSNBC because they would be more culturally in line with one another. This even could extend to the type of language that you want to take in your information. If you were a Spanish speaker, for instance, you might prefer to get your news and information from Telemundo, a Spanish speaking station, as opposed to an English speaking station, even if you speak both languages, because you believe that the cultural values of Telemundo more align with your Spanish speaking heritage. And so those are just a couple of examples. Here's a real world interpretation of this. Which approach to Michael Jackson do you actually believe? Do you believe he's the greatest entertainer of all time? Or do you believe he's the wacko jacko? For me personally, I love Michael Jackson and I think he is one of the greatest entertainers of all time. And so when the media call him wacko jacko, it really kind of irritates me and frustrates me, where someone else may see these and recall him naming his baby Blanket and holding him out on the balcony and things like that, and really dismiss him being the greatest entertainer of all time because of those actions. And so our current views and beliefs will depend, will shape how we interpret these different media messages about the same person. And so I don't know what your personal beliefs are, but think about how you react to both of those statements about him. And it might tell you how you would selectively expose yourself to media messages about Michael Jackson. Our textbook talks about the cultural approach of media focusing on how meaning is produced rather than on how messages are transmitted. And this is a really important part of this course. It's how this entire semester I want us to talk about mass communication. I could do an intro to mass communication course and teach you the difference between the FM and the AM wave signals, or teach you basic history about all the different types of media, from the printing press all the way to social media. That is important, but what's even more important is focusing on how those messages produce meaning for larger culture and the influences on that cultural influence. So meaning is really made through three primary things, and we'll keep coming back to this throughout the semester. Meaning is made from the creator's vision. The source of the information kind of creates meaning by the ways that they shape their messages and share their information. The industry or the organizations also control the production and distribution of those messages. And so meaning is made based on kind of economic, social, and political power in those instances. And finally, the audience has a great ability to shape that meaning as well, because we all have fragmented responses to media, and that can change how media and mass communication are interpreted in our everyday lives. Media and mass communication is so important, and I hope that you continue to see this, that media will shape society's perceptions about events in the ways that they present them. When new narratives are introduced into a culture, it can completely upend what is considered acceptable and things that should be celebrated. We can look at the transformation of the protest movements throughout time and see how narratives about those protests and the social movements that were behind them have really transformed through the media coverage of those battles for equal rights or gun control, whatever it may be. And so the narratives that we find even in entertainment can be very transformative for culture as well, and shape perceptions about those movements, about events, or even about individual people. Prior to I Love Lucy, for instance, Lucille Ball became the first woman to ever appear pregnant on media channels because it was considered inappropriate to see a pregnant woman on TV prior to that time. It was also considered inappropriate to show your belly button, but Cher apparently forgot that when she dressed for the Sonny and Cher show, becoming the first woman to expose her midriff. Now we laugh at that and we, think about what red carpets look like every day. But Cher was really groundbreaking in being able to show her midriff and change the rules of fashion for media through that event. I think about very transformative movements in media, such as Ellen coming out on her syndicated comedy show, and how that really gave a lot of power to the LGBTQ plus movement. And think about what a force she is in the industry at this time, even though she thought that coming out as a lesbian would end her career. I also look at the first interracial kiss on Star Trek and how important that was for minorities, especially Black people, to be able to see themselves represented on television in one of the first times on television in an acceptable way, and the movement that started for better representation on media. These tiny moments may seem very small when we look back in all types of mass communication, but as we'll see throughout the semester, these small moments become very important, influential parts about changing society at large. And that's why it's so important for us to understand how mass communication and media operate. The power of media in everyday life is important to think about because it helps us to understand our fear, our stereotypes, and how we define culture and thus individuals and organizations. Even back in ancient times and ancient Rome and Greece, philosophers feared the impact of popular culture, which at that time was poetry, because they felt that it would diminish the rhetoric of these philosophers. Elvis Presley and his dancing on the Ed Sullivan Show, shaking his hips, it was considered completely controversial and inappropriate at the time. And now we almost laugh looking back at the Elvis Presley show at how wholesome and demure his dancing seemed. But if you were a young girl in 1956 and you saw these hips shake, you'd be screaming too. He had some pretty good moves, so you got to give him that. I also think about the fear of rap culture and rock cultures throughout the decades and how transformative those music genres have been in transforming our societies. I think about NWA and their various songs that were very important, but specifically Express Yourself really challenged, sorry, this ad. Don't you love ads? NWA, there we go. NWA actually had a lot of very controversial and yet important songs that spoke about stereotypes against Blacks and African Americans, even addressing slavery and imprisonment of Black Americans, specifically Black males. And these were important topics for people to consider. And when we were doing it through the modality of music and through rap, it became transformative for a lot of people. I still know this, but I won't rap it for you. That would be embarrassing. But think about how important mass communication was in shaping the broader culture during those times, and what kind of impact will our communication today have on our future. The media also has a powerful influence on children, and I think it's worth noting here. Kids watch 40,000 commercials a year. And we wonder why we are a consumer culture here in America. In addition, a child in the United States will see 200,000 violent acts and 16,000 murders by the age of 18, which really transforms the way that they view the world. Most of us view the world as very scary because of the violent effects that media can have. And so these are things that we need to be studying and considering more, because much of the impact of media is still relatively unknown. Media also have a large influence on culture through economic means. The media industries are a very powerful force in American culture because of their financial gain. They make over $700 billion a year, and many media owners, there are very few of them. And so they are very powerful entities. You think about Disney or Google, Apple. They are powerful organizations within our country and around the world. Especially with targeted advertising, media organizations can know how to make us buy products and even how we're going to vote based on our media consumption. And so it's really important that we become media literate, that we understand how media works so that we will be less susceptible to undue media influence. How can you do this? One of the major ways is through the critical process of media literacy. The critical process means that you take in every piece of communication from the media through a critical lens. You ask and note, why is this communication being shared with me and how does it affect me? The first step is description. You're kind of just researching, you're taking notes about important things, you're describing what the media is trying to tell you. You analyze the information. You discover and focus on patterns. For instance, why is media so violent? Why would that be important to note a pattern of violent communication within a lot of media? Interpretation. What does this mean for ourselves, for our lives? The so what? So what if Apple is coming out with this new phone that costs thousands of dollars? What does that mean for our lives? So we interpret it. Then we evaluate it. We make a judgment about the message, the source, the purpose, and we try to decide whether the communication that is being shared is worthwhile and whether or not it is true. And then we try to engage with the communication around us. This is when we connect to our critical perspective, the things that we've already discussed, and we become media literate citizens that can call out communication that is unfair, that is misinformation, as some people like to say, fake news, and we make our voice heard. I think about how many of you are actually media creators, whether you know it or not. Every time that you're posting a picture to Instagram or sharing a video through TikTok, you're actually media creators, you're mass communicators. And so therefore it's important that you take on this critical process, even with the things that you're creating yourself. We all are stories in the end. And so we want to make sure that they're good ones. And being media literate allows us to do that. So now that you've watched this video, which describes one part of chapter 1, I want you to go into the discussion post called Mass Communication in Your Life, follow the directions, and make sure to reply to 2 of your classmates. Remember, I'm looking for quality of response rather than quantity. So don't worry about writing a lot of information. Just write information that really makes sense and that you've thought through. And then once you're done with that discussion post, you can pick up in part 2 of chapter 1 and watch that video.